In this demo, I'm going to do a deep dive into commands and show you how to use them to communicate from the view down to the view model in a loosely coupled way. The starting point for this demo is basically the ending point for the demos in the last module, where we had our customer list view hooked up with a data grid and a list box presenting customer data from a view model that just exposed that customer data. So to get started here, we're going to drop into the customer list view, and we're going to add a button at the top of the screen for deleting a customer. Now, working with commands on buttons is very easy because they have a command property to hook up to an iCommand. So we can expose a property on our view model that is an iCommand and bind to it from the button's command property, like so. With this definition, we expect to have a delete command property of type iCommand exposed from our view model. And as the XAML gets parsed here, several things are going to happen. First, it's going to call the get block on that iCommand property to get a reference to the command object. Then it's going to call canExecute on that command to determine the initial enabled or disabled state of the command, and it will enable or disable the button as a result. Then it will subscribe to canExecute changed on that iCommand, and that allows it to be notified in the future if the enabled or disabled state of that command changes. So now we need a delete command on our view model. Let's go there. So we can drop into our view model here and add a public property of type iCommand. I make it a private setter because this should only be set once inside the view model itself on construction. Now we need a concrete type that implements iCommand to put into that property. The one I'm going to use in this demo is already in the project in the download code. It's called relay command. And this is a simple delegating implementation of iCommand where we have two delegates, one for the execute method and one for the canExecute method. Those can be passed in on construction, and you can see there's two overloaded constructors, one for only an execute method and one for both an execute method and a canExecute method. The implementation of iCommand is fairly straightforward. When either of the methods are invoked, it just checks to see if there is a delegate for that method and invokes it. And in the case of the canExecute, if there is no delegate for that, it'll return true, meaning it's always enabled. So back over in our view model, I'm going to change this property to be of type relay command instead of just iCommand. And now we need to construct an instance and put it into that property, which we'll do up here in the constructor. So I could just use the constructor that only takes an execute method, which I'll call onDelete and add in just a moment. And then that command would always be enabled. But we're going to hook up enable disable logic in a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and also supply a canExecute method. And we'll call that method canDelete. Now let me go ahead and stub both those methods out. And for the moment, I'll just return true from canDelete. Now our view model is going to need some context of what customer is it supposed to be deleting from the collection. One way we could try to address that is the fact that a command can take an argument. The signature of the canExecute and execute methods on iCommand have a single argument of type object. So we could pass down an argument using the command parameter property of the button. However, I'm going to do it a little bit different way that is more in tune with the way MVVM works. We're going to expose another property from our view model that the view can bind to, so that the view model can always know what the current context is in terms of selection. So I've added a new selected customer property, and we can go over to the view now and set it up so that it's always being populated when selections are made in the data grid. To do that, I just drop over to the view, go to my data grid, and set the selected item property bound to the selected customer property on my view model. Now the view model will always be in tune with what the selection is, and it can use that as the context for the command. So now we can drop back over to the view model, to the onDelete method, and simply remove the selected customer from the customer's collection when the delete button is pressed and the command fires. With that, we can go ahead and run. And we can see that if I select a customer and click delete, it's removed from the collection both in the data grid and in the list box down below. Since they're both bound to the same collection, that collection is an observable collection and it raises collection changed events whenever an item is added or removed from the collection. However, one problem with our implementation right now is that the delete button is always enabled even if nothing is selected. So let's change that. As a starting point, all we need to do is make it so that the canDelete logic is driven by whether a customer is selected or not. Since we already have that context through our selected customer property, we can just check for null on that and return the result to indicate whether we should be enabled or not. However, if we run with just that in place, we can see the button is now disabled at first, but when we make a selection, it doesn't change. Again, that is because of the process I described up front. It calls canExecute when the binding is first evaluated as the XAML is being parsed, and it subscribes to the canExecute changed event. But it won't ever check again unless you raise the canExecute changed event. Well, we have a good place that we can do that in our view model. We know that the selected customer is going to be set through our other binding. So if we just drop in here to the set block and call raise canExecute changed on the command, we'll be good to go. With that in place, we can go ahead and run. We can see the button starts disabled. When we make a selection, it becomes enabled. And when we delete, it becomes disabled again because there's no longer a selection. Working perfectly. The last thing I want to show in this demo is how you can hook up input gestures to trigger your bindings, such as keyboard shortcuts. All you need to do for that is drop into the view and add input bindings as a collection on the root element. The primary kind of input binding you'll probably use is a keyboard shortcut. Those are called key bindings, and you can see you can set the key and modifiers, in this case Control-D, as the keystroke that's going to trigger our delete command. And then we just point to the same command property that we did from the button, making that an alternate invoker for that command. With that in place, we can run. I can make a selection, hit Control-D, and you can see it deletes the same as clicking the button does. So that's how you use commands to communicate from your view to your view model to invoke some logic down in the view model.